At dawn, the air over the small seaside town was cool and still, carrying the faint smell of salt and wet wood. For more than 20 years, an elderly man named Robert Hensley had walked the same path down to the fishing pier with a tackle box under his arm and a thermos of coffee tucked into his jacket. He was 74, retired from his job at the local shipyard, and his life had narrowed into predictable rhythms. He was the kind of man everyone in town recognized. Fishermen setting out early knew his quiet wave. Store owners knew he'd be in later for bait and bread. And neighbors knew that if he wasn't seen on the pier at sunrise, something was wrong. On the morning of his disappearance, several locals remembered him setting up just as the sun rose. He leaned over the railing, tying knots, preparing his lines with the care of someone who had repeated the same motions countless times. One man recalled hearing him humming under his breath as he arranged the bait. Another saw him settle into his folding chair and pour from the thermos, his routine as unshakable as the tide itself. By mid-morning, however, something shifted. Those who passed by the pier noticed the odd quiet. His chair was empty, but his gear was still in place. His jacket was draped over the railing, as though he had only stepped away for a moment. A half-packed tackle box sat at his feet. At first, no one thought much of it. Fishermen often wandered to stretch their legs or greet others. Yet as the hours dragged on and the chair remained vacant, unease grew. By noon, a passerby who knew Robert well stopped long enough to look around, calling his name into the air. No answer came, only the lapping of water against the pilings. That was when the first phone call was made to the local police. An elderly man had vanished from the pier, leaving his belongings as if he had evaporated in daylight. Officers arrived quickly, expecting perhaps a medical emergency or a fall into the water. They examined the pier closely. The chair, the jacket, the tackle box, and the coffee thermos were all there, undisturbed. Nothing appeared knocked over. There were no signs of a struggle, no marks on the wood, no broken railing to suggest an accident. One officer crouched to study the tide line. The water that morning had been calm, with no strong currents that could have swept someone away unnoticed. Still, they leaned over the edge, scanning for bubbles, floating clothing, or any ripple that might indicate a body below. Nothing broke the surface. The situation grew more alarming when the family was contacted. His daughter explained that Robert's health was steady. He wasn't known to wander or forget things. He was careful, consistent, and fiercely independent. He lived alone but kept a strict schedule. Every morning, the pier. Every evening, home before dark. He had no known enemies, no debts, and no reason to simply vanish. His family's voices grew strained as they told officers that he would never abandon his belongings, and certainly not his jacket on a cool morning. They feared something had gone terribly wrong. Word spread quickly through the tight-knit community. By late afternoon, more neighbors and fishermen had gathered along the pier, peering down into the water and whispering theories. Some were convinced he had slipped and drowned, though the officers reminded them the tide had been calm. Others murmured about strangers seen near the pier earlier in the week. A few shook their heads, unsettled by the way his possessions sat untouched, like a frozen snapshot of his last moments. The pier, normally a place of leisure and routine, had become the center of a growing mystery. As daylight faded, the police marked off the area, turning the familiar wooden boards into a search scene. Flashlights swept across the surface of the water, and officers began contacting nearby marinas for boats and search equipment. For the first time in decades, the quiet fishing town felt the weight of something larger than a simple accident. An elderly man had walked to the pier just as he always had, but by midday, he was gone. No witnesses, no signs of struggle, no trace of where he went. The evening ended with investigators standing over his belongings, silent, uneasy, and aware that they were facing more than just a routine disappearance. The missing man's absence had begun to feel like a hole cut out of the town itself, and the question lingered, unspoken but heavy in every mind. How does a man disappear from an open pier in broad daylight, leaving behind everything except himself? The officers who first stepped onto the pier noted the scene in detail. Robert's folding chair was tipped slightly forward, angled toward the railing as though he had stood up quickly and never returned. Beside it lay his tackle box, half packed with lures and lines scattered loosely, as if he had been in the middle of arranging them. His thermos was still capped, the coffee inside lukewarm by the time investigators picked it up. His jacket remained draped over the railing, pockets containing his wallet and house keys. Nothing appeared missing, nothing appeared broken, and there were no scuff marks or drag lines across the wooden planks to suggest a struggle. It was a picture of a routine interrupted in a single instant. Investigators quickly pulled tide charts and weather records for that morning. The data confirmed what witnesses had said. The water had been calm, with no significant current or wind strong enough to create an accident unnoticed. If Robert had fallen, the splash would have echoed, and someone fishing nearby would almost certainly have seen or heard something. Even more perplexing was the lack of any disturbance. His bait bucket was still perched upright, filled with water, hooks glinting beneath the surface. It seemed impossible that a man could vanish in the middle of preparing his gear without leaving behind even the faintest clue. The first interviews were conducted right there on the pier. A local fisherman described seeing Robert tying a line around 7 in the morning, focused and unhurried. Another claimed to have walked past just before 8, nodding to him as he sat in his chair, sipping from the thermos. After that, no one remembered seeing him again. The timeline narrowed sharply. He had disappeared sometime between 8 and 10 in daylight, in view of the open water and the narrow boardwalk. Officers tried to imagine every possibility: a sudden medical episode, a fall, a deliberate walk away. Yet none of these scenarios explained why his belongings remained exactly where he had left them. Family members were brought to the scene in the afternoon. His daughter and son-in-law stood silently over the chair and jacket, disbelief etched across their faces. They explained to officers that Robert was meticulous, almost stubborn about routine. He never left his tackle box disorganized. He never left without taking his wallet. And he never went anywhere without his jacket, even in mild weather. To them, these details screamed of something unnatural. The family pushed back against the idea of an accident, insisting he was too careful, too experienced to have slipped unnoticed into calm water. He had fished these piers for decades, knew every railing, every tide, every shift of the boards underfoot. Their certainty left officers uneasy. The area was combed for footprints or discarded items. Nothing out of the ordinary appeared. The wooden boards of the pier were weathered smooth, too worn to capture any impressions. No dropped cap or hat, no broken fishing rod, no evidence to mark a struggle. Even the tipped chair could be explained away. It was lightweight, prone to wobble in the breeze, or perhaps nudged as someone stood up. Yet when viewed with the rest of the belongings, it only deepened the unsettling sense that Robert had stood for a moment and never returned. Officers questioned themselves as much as they did the family. Could he have quietly decided to walk off, leaving everything behind? The family dismissed the theory immediately. Robert was proud, but not reckless. His health was steady, his finances stable, and there was no sign of depression or intent to disappear. His pantry was stocked, bills paid, and he had plans later that week with his grandchildren. None of it aligned with the idea of a man simply walking away from his life. That evening, as investigators collected the items into evidence bags, the weight of the scene settled heavier. Each object, the jacket, the chair, the box, was ordinary, yet together they formed a puzzle that resisted every explanation. Officers made note that the tide charts had ruled out an accidental drowning, at least in the way most imagined. No turbulence, no strong currents, no unusual weather. The pier itself was sturdy, its railings intact, its edges secure. A fall seemed unlikely, and so the theory of an unseen hand, whether human or otherwise, began to whisper at the edges of the case. As the sun dropped behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the water, the pier was finally cleared. What remained in its silence was not just the absence of an old fisherman, but the absence of reason. To investigators, the mystery had shifted from a search for a missing man to the search for any explanation at all. What could make a man vanish without leaving behind the smallest trace, in a place where every sign of his presence remained? That question would carry into the next day's search, a question that no one seemed able to answer. The following morning, the pier was no longer just a quiet place for fishing. It had become the epicenter of a coordinated search. Officers had already concluded that Robert's disappearance could not be explained by the items left behind, and so the next logical step was to search the waters that stretched out from the wooden planks. Boats were brought in from nearby marinas, and search crews prepared lines, sonar equipment, and drag nets. Divers suited up with the kind of grim efficiency that comes when searching for a body rather than a living person. For the first time, the community saw their pier transformed into what looked like a crime scene, a place where the answers had to be hidden beneath the surface. On the first day, divers descended in pairs, feeling their way along the pilings, searching the shadows below. The tide was calm, the water clear enough in places to see several feet ahead, yet they surfaced again and again with nothing to report. No floating clothing, no human form caught against rocks, no trace of Robert at all. On deck, sonar scans displayed the depths of the inlet, showing contours and shadows, but none matched the shape they were hoping to find. Every hour that passed without discovery added to the growing sense that something about the case did not fit. Locals gathered at the edges of the cordoned area, watching silently. Some were fellow fishermen, men who had known Robert for decades and understood his habits as well as their own. They muttered among themselves that if he had fallen, someone would have seen the splash. The pier that morning had not been deserted. It was a weekday, but several men had been casting lines in the early hours. Each insisted the water had remained undisturbed, glassy, and calm. No shouts, no calls for help, no ripples breaking the quiet routine. Their certainty only reinforced the sense that the water was not the answer. By the second day, regional media arrived. Reporters stood with notepads, recording the sight of search boats spreading across the inlet. They spoke to neighbors who described Robert as steady, reliable, and not the kind of man to simply wander away. They repeated the unsettling detail that his wallet and keys were still in his jacket, that his coffee had been left unfinished. To the public, it was more than just a disappearance. It was a man erased from a familiar landscape without warning. News outlets asked the same question investigators were already struggling with. If not the water, then where? That evening, sonar revealed several shapes worth investigating. Divers returned to the water, descending again with careful precision, but the objects turned out to be nothing more than debris. An old bicycle frame, a sunken tire, scraps of netting long abandoned. Each false lead was frustrating, not only to the crews, but to the family waiting on shore. Robert's daughter stood at the edge of the pier with her husband, watching silently as boats moved in slow arcs. She clutched a folded photograph of her father, the kind taken at a family cookout years earlier, as though willing the crews to find him so the waiting could end. On the third day, the search widened beyond the pier itself. Boats dragged nets farther along the coast, combing through reeds and shallow coves. Cadaver dogs were brought to boats in hopes that they might catch a trace of human scent rising from the water. The dogs sniffed and shifted uneasily, but gave no clear alerts. It was as though the inlet had swallowed nothing at all. Officers reviewed tide schedules, hoping to find evidence that the current might have carried a body out into the open sea. But charts showed the water patterns had been gentle, unlikely to move anything so far, so quickly. By now, theories began to spread beyond the town. Some speculated that Robert had grown disoriented, that perhaps a medical episode had caused him to wander off the pier and down the shoreline. Others suggested something darker, that he may have met someone there, a stranger who led him away. Police could not rule out foul play, but the lack of evidence left every theory fragile. The more time passed, the more unlikely it seemed that the water held the answers. On the evening of the third day, the lead investigator stood before reporters and admitted what no one wanted to hear. Despite exhaustive searches by divers, sonar, and boats, there was no sign of Robert in the inlet or the waters beyond. For his family, the words landed like a stone. If the water had no answers, then the question of where he had gone only grew larger. Neighbors went home unsettled, aware that their familiar pier had been transformed into a place where someone could vanish in full daylight, leaving nothing but silence behind. The search had ended with empty hands, but the absence of discovery only deepened the mystery. As the last boats pulled away from the pier, investigators turned their focus inland. If Robert was not in the water, then the explanation had to lie elsewhere, and that meant considering possibilities far more unsettling than an accidental fall. In the weeks following the failed water searches, the investigation settled into a grim stillness. Patrol cars no longer lined the pier, and the divers had packed their gear away. What remained was a file of unanswered questions and a community unable to explain how a man could vanish so cleanly. Without a body, the sense of certainty that usually guided cases like this dissolved into speculation, and in a town as small as this one, speculation grew quickly. At the diner near the waterfront, conversations turned to Robert almost daily. Some patrons leaned in close, lowering their voices, whispering about debts he might have owed. A handful of locals claimed he had once been seen playing cards for money in the back of a bar years earlier, though none could provide evidence that he had ever owed more than a few dollars at a time. Others spoke more cautiously about tension within his family. They recalled a disagreement between Robert and his brother over the inheritance of their late mother's house. To some, the feud was nothing more than the kind of bitter argument that cooled with time. To others, it was enough to plant the seed of darker possibilities. The police followed each lead carefully. They interviewed his brother, who admitted the disagreement but insisted they had moved past it years earlier. Officers noted his cooperation and his willingness to open his home, but still, suspicion lingered in the air. Investigators also looked into Robert's financial records. Bank statements revealed no suspicious withdrawals, no sudden debts, no unexplained cash flow. His pension checks arrived regularly, his bills were up to date, and he lived within his means. The theory of gambling debts faded, unsupported by facts, but in the absence of answers, rumors proved harder to silence than evidence could disprove. Others in town suggested Robert had been lonely, that perhaps he had chosen to walk away. This idea was dismissed almost immediately by his daughter, who insisted he was grounded by his routines, his family, and his love of the water. He had no history of wandering, no diagnosis of dementia, and no signs of depression. To her, the theory felt like an insult, an easy excuse offered by those who could not imagine something more sinister. Police quietly agreed. Nothing in Robert's life suggested a man who would abandon everything familiar without explanation. Yet, as each rumor circulated, the pressure on investigators mounted. They revisited the pier, hoping fresh eyes might reveal what had been missed. They canvassed the neighborhood again, knocking on doors, asking residents if they had noticed any strangers or unfamiliar cars parked nearby that morning. A few claimed they had seen a dark sedan idling near the marina, but no one could recall a license plate, and no consistent description of the driver emerged. The lead went nowhere. Even the fishermen who had sworn the waters were calm began to question themselves. Had they missed something? Could Robert have fallen silently into the inlet without anyone noticing? It seemed impossible, but as days turned into weeks, even the most certain witnesses began to wonder if their memories were reliable. Time eroded. Confidence and the lack of evidence left everyone second-guessing what they thought they knew. The absence of a body became the most haunting detail of all. Without it, there could be no closure, no definitive cause of death, no way to separate truth from rumor. Detectives privately admitted that cases like this were the hardest. An elderly man, no signs of violence, no body to examine. Each theory was possible, yet none could be proven. One officer later recalled that it felt as though the investigation had been swallowed whole, leaving nothing but fragments of possibility. For Robert's family, the rumors were cruel. His daughter avoided the diner and the grocery store for fear of overhearing whispers about her father's supposed secrets. She clung instead to what she knew. He had been reliable, proud, and devoted to his grandchildren. The suggestion that he had debts or dark grudges struck her as hollow attempts to explain the unexplainable. She grew angry at the gossip, but angrier at the silence from the investigation. Each day without news deepened the sense that her father had been erased, both from the pier and from the urgency of the town. As months passed, the case slipped from the front page of the regional papers. Larger stories consumed attention, and Robert's disappearance became just another cold file on a shelf. But within the community, it remained unsolved in the most unsettling way. A man gone, possessions left behind, no struggle, no witnesses, no body. For those who had watched the water that morning and seen nothing, the memory was almost unbearable. The image of his empty chair became a lingering reminder of how fragile normalcy could be. And so the investigation stalled, the rumors multiplied, and the silence of the pier grew heavier. Without a body, there was nothing to hold on to, no anchor for the truth. Just an old man who had walked into his routine one morning and never returned. For the police, it meant turning the case into a cold file. For the family, it meant living with questions that would not go away. And for the town, it meant accepting that perhaps the still waters they had trusted all their lives had taken something more than they were willing to admit. In the weeks after the official search was called off, the burden of finding Robert shifted almost entirely onto his family. His daughter organized her own searches along the shoreline, carrying printed flyers with his picture stapled at the top. She and her teenage son walked for miles, placing them on telephone poles, in shop windows, and at every marina where fishermen might recognize him. His grandchildren helped in smaller ways, trailing behind with stacks of flyers or calling out into the reeds along the waterline, their voices breaking in the wind. The police had gone quiet, treating the case as suspended until new evidence emerged, but for the family there was no pause. Every walk along the inlet was both a search for clues and a desperate attempt to make sense of his absence. Friends of the family often joined in, forming small groups that combed through fields, checked empty sheds, and drove slowly down coastal roads looking for any sign. They never found anything more than discarded bottles, scraps of netting, or driftwood washed ashore. Each fruitless search left the family with heavier hearts. His son-in-law admitted privately that these searches felt like chasing a ghost, yet he kept joining, unwilling to leave his wife to grieve alone. The children, once hopeful, grew restless, confused by how a man so constant in their lives could vanish without explanation. As the months passed, the posters weathered in the rain, their edges curling, colors fading, but his daughter refused to take them down. She insisted that as long as his face remained visible in the community, there was still a chance someone might come forward. Neighbors avoided removing them too, aware of the pain it would cause. The town grew used to the sight, Robert's picture staring out from poles and store windows, a permanent reminder of a mystery unresolved. The strain of his absence began to weigh heavily inside the family home. Meals grew quieter, conversations shorter, as each member carried their own version of guilt. His daughter blamed herself for not calling him that morning, something she usually did to check in. His brother carried the weight of their past argument, convinced the disappearance had stolen the chance for reconciliation. Even the grandchildren, though too young to fully understand, asked questions that tore at the adults. Couldn't the police look harder? Why couldn't they find him? Each question was both innocent and brutal, a reminder of what was missing. By the 6th month, the family faced a painful decision. With no progress in the investigation and no body to bury, they chose to hold a memorial service. It was not a funeral. There was no casket, no gravesite, but a gathering of friends, neighbors, and relatives who came together to speak his name aloud. Photographs of Robert were placed on a table. One of him in his younger years at the shipyard, another of him smiling with a fishing rod in hand, and several of him surrounded by his grandchildren. Stories were told, voices breaking as they described his habits, his stubborn humor, his devotion to family. For some, the service offered comfort, a way to release what had been building inside for months. But for others, it felt like betrayal. His daughter stood apart for much of the gathering, refusing to accept that her father was gone without proof. To her, a memorial was too final, too much like admitting defeat in the search. She believed he deserved more than a symbolic goodbye. That division between acceptance and refusal widened within the family, creating small fractures that turned into open wounds. Some wanted closure, others demanded persistence, and the tension between those needs left them isolated from one another at the very moment they needed unity most. Neighbors noticed the change. Where once the family had appeared at every community event together, they began attending separately or not at all. The disappearance was no longer just a mystery. It had become a wedge, driving them apart with unspoken blame and unresolved grief. Each time someone passed the pier, they were reminded not only of Robert but of the silence that had consumed his family. The pier itself changed meaning for them. What had once been a place of comfort, where they could imagine him sitting in his chair at dawn, became unbearable to visit. His daughter admitted that she avoided driving past it, unable to face the image of his last known moments. His grandchildren, who once loved to walk the boards and watch the waves with him, now associated it with loss. The wooden planks, the creaking rails, the smell of salt, every detail of the pier was now tied to absence. As time pushed the case further into the background for police, the family's private search began to lose momentum. Resources dwindled, energy drained, and even hope became fragile. Yet none of them spoke openly about giving up. Instead, their grief lived quietly inside them, surfacing in small arguments, long silences, or sudden tears. 6 months after Robert had vanished, the family was no closer to answers than they had been on the first day. They had searched the waters, walked the shores, clung to rumors, and buried themselves in guilt. All that remained was the image of his empty chair, his jacket, and the silence of the pier that had taken him. The case was now not only a mystery, but a fracture line in the lives of those who loved him. And for investigators, the absence of new leads only confirmed what they already feared. Without new evidence, Robert's disappearance would soon shift from an active case to another cold file. As the seasons turned into years, the urgency that once surrounded Robert's disappearance slowly eroded. The pier returned to its familiar routines, fishermen casting lines at dawn, children running along its boards in summer, tourists stopping to take pictures of the horizon. But for his family, the place never felt the same. What had once been a center of community life remained stained by absence. Yet, for law enforcement, the case shifted gradually into the background. After months with no evidence, no body, and no credible leads, Robert's file was moved from the active investigations desk into the shelves where cold cases were stored. The cold case room was a place that every detective dreaded, but knew too well. It held the unsolved fragments of lives left unanswered, disappearances, suspicious deaths, crimes with no resolution. Robert's file was thick at first, filled with witness statements, sonar readings, and search maps. But as years passed, only a few thin sheets were added, each one representing a new tip or rumor. Most led nowhere. A sighting of an elderly man walking along a coastal highway turned out to be someone else entirely. A fisherman's claim that he had seen an argument near the pier dissolved when no other witnesses confirmed it. The file grew older, its pages yellowing, while the man it represented remained missing. Occasionally, new detectives would inherit the file as part of their caseload. They would flip through it, reading the details of the vanished fisherman who left his chair, jacket, and coffee behind. Each new set of eyes brought a small spark of possibility. Perhaps someone fresh could see what others had missed. But without evidence to test, without a body to examine, each review ended in the same place: speculation without resolution. And with every passing year, fresher cases demanded attention, pulling resources away from the mysteries that refused to move forward. Still, the community never fully let go. On the anniversary of his disappearance, local papers sometimes ran short pieces, reminding readers of the fisherman who had vanished without a trace. Neighbors brought up his name quietly, usually in the form of questions that carried no answers. Some fishermen swore they remembered seeing a dark-colored car parked near the pier that morning, sitting for hours without moving. Others recalled an unfamiliar man watching the water from the end of the pier days before Robert disappeared. None of these fragments fit into anything solid. They were the kind of memories that surfaced too late, softened by time, impossible to verify. His family lived with the silence more than anyone. Each holiday was marked not just by his absence, but by the absence of truth. His daughter found herself replaying small details endlessly. His tackle box half-packed, his chair angled forward, his jacket left behind. She wondered if some clue had been overlooked, something she might have noticed but didn't. Guilt lingered in every conversation, even years later. His brother grew more withdrawn, reluctant to speak about Robert at all, as though silence was the only way to survive the weight of what had been left undone. For investigators, cases like Robert's carried a different kind of frustration. Without new evidence, there was no progress. Without progress, there was no resolution. And without resolution, a case became little more than a haunting presence in the background of every detective's career. The file sat on the shelf, its label fading with age, waiting for a piece of information that never seemed to arrive. 6 years after Robert vanished, a new detective pulled the file as part of a routine cold case review. He noted the oddities, the absence of disturbance, the calm water, the intact belongings. He flagged the case for follow-up interviews, hoping that someone's memory might sharpen with time. A few fishermen were re-interviewed. One repeated the story of the car. Another claimed he had seen a stranger lingering near the pier days before. The descriptions were vague, contradictory, and unhelpful. The file returned to the shelf. Years blended together. The pier weathered storms, was repaired, and continued to stand. Children who had grown up hearing whispers about the disappearance became adults who told the story like a local legend. And through it all, Robert's family lived in a space between grief and uncertainty. They had no grave to visit, no certainty of death, no answers. Just a pier, a chair, and a silence that stretched across decades. By the 15th year, Robert's name was spoken less often outside of his family. The town had moved on, and newer tragedies claimed headlines. Yet his case was never forgotten entirely. For those who had been there that day, who had seen his chair, his jacket, his tackle box, the mystery remained sharp. They knew something had happened on that pier, something that had never been explained. And then, in the 16th year, an unexpected discovery at sea would bring Robert's case back into focus. Fishermen hauling their nets offshore snagged something heavy, something tangled and resistant. At first, they thought it was nothing more than debris. But what they pulled aboard would reopen a case long left to gather dust, forcing both investigators and family to face the possibility that the truth had been resting beneath the surface all along. It was a gray morning on the water when the first sign of Robert's disappearance surfaced again. 16 years had passed, and for most of the town, the memory of the old fisherman had blurred into the background of local history. But for a crew of commercial fishermen working a few miles offshore, the day began with the kind of routine that mirrored Robert's own habits long ago, baiting lines, hauling nets, and watching the horizon. Around mid-morning, one of the nets dragged heavier than expected. At first, they assumed it had snagged on rocks or tangled with abandoned gear. The men pulled together, straining against the weight. What finally broke the surface was not the usual catch, but a dark, barnacle-encrusted mass that looked more like debris than anything alive. The object clung stubbornly to the net, heavy with years of growth. Seaweed trailed from it in long strands, and the smell of salt and decay drifted across the deck. The crew gathered around, poking at it with gaffs and boat hooks, trying to make sense of what they had dredged up. At first glance, it resembled scrap metal, perhaps part of an old engine or fishing equipment left to rust on the seabed. But as they cut away the netting to free their gear, one of the men noticed the shape of something too precise, too human. A curve of bone beneath the layers of growth, pale and unmistakable. The laughter and banter on deck fell silent as realization spread. This wasn't junk. It was a body, or what was left of one. The fishermen reacted quickly, alerting authorities as they secured the remains. They had no way of knowing who it was, only that it was human, tangled in nets that had been left on the seafloor for years. The Coast Guard was called, and the discovery was logged immediately as potential evidence in a long-forgotten case. For investigators, the news was jarring. Cold cases rarely resurfaced with something so concrete. Within hours, officers were preparing to meet the boat at the dock, ready to take possession of the remains that might finally explain what had happened on the pier 16 years earlier. When the vessel returned to shore, word spread quickly. News crews arrived before the officers, their cameras pointed at the fishermen unloading the grim find. The men refused to speak in detail, shaken by what they had seen. They had expected a day of ordinary work, and instead had pulled from the sea something that carried the weight of the town's most unsettling mystery. The remains, tangled in rotted clothing and still intertwined with old fishing line, were placed in the care of forensic teams. Onlookers stood at a distance, whispering the name they all thought but did not say aloud. For the family, the phone call came like a jolt out of the dark. After more than a decade of silence, investigators were asking them to come in. Robert's daughter sat stunned, unable to process the idea that her father's remains might have been recovered after so many years. She had lived in a state of suspended grief, never knowing if he had drowned, walked away, or been taken. Now, the possibility of answers was both terrifying and relieving. His grandchildren, now adults, gathered around her. They had grown up in the shadow of his disappearance, their childhoods shaped by a mystery no one could solve. For them, the idea of recovery felt surreal. At the station, officers explained the process. Forensic teams would examine the remains, compare DNA, and analyze clothing fragments for confirmation. Nothing could be said with certainty yet, but the location, the condition, and the timing all pointed toward one possibility. The family listened, their faces pale, as investigators described the tangled mass of line and netting that had been pulled from the water. It was as though the sea had preserved a secret all these years, only releasing it by accident. The discovery reignited interest in the case. Media outlets who had long moved on returned with headlines about the Pier mystery and the possibility that it might finally be solved. Reporters revisited the original details, the empty chair, the half-packed tackle box, the jacket draped over the railing. They compared them now to the disturbing image of bones recovered offshore. Talk shows speculated wildly. Had Robert slipped, become ensnared in his own gear, and drifted out to sea? Or had someone forced him into the water, leaving him to sink beneath nets that held him captive for years? Investigators returned to the pier once more, standing over the same boards where he had last been seen. They reviewed old photographs of the search, the interviews, the rumors that had swirled through town. Now, for the first time, they had something physical to connect to the case. Yet the discovery raised as many questions as it answered. The presence of fishing line around the remains suggested entanglement, but whether it had been accidental or deliberate was unclear. The fishermen who had pulled the nets in remained unsettled. They spoke of the weight, the unnatural shape, the way the deck had gone silent when they realized what they had found. They admitted that even after decades on the water, nothing had ever shaken them quite like that moment. It was as if they had accidentally pulled the past into the present, dragging with it the weight of everything the town thought it had lost. As the remains were prepared for forensic testing, Robert's family braced themselves for confirmation. 16 years of silence had ended with a discovery no one expected. The pier, once a place of rumor and grief, was now tied directly to the evidence pulled from the sea. For investigators, the disturbing remnant raised the possibility that Robert's disappearance was never an accident at all. And, as the file shifted from forgotten shelves back into the hands of detectives, the question once buried in silence returned with new force. Had the fisherman been taken by the water, or by someone who wanted him gone? The discovery was secured under tight control the moment the boat docked. Deputies and Coast Guard officers worked carefully, lifting the heavy barnacle-covered mass from the deck and into evidence containers large enough to hold the tangle of line, sea growth, and bone. For years, the mystery of the fisherman's disappearance had been nothing more than faded photos and quiet speculation. Now, for the first time in 16 years, investigators had something physical, something real. Word spread quickly that human remains had been recovered, and the whispers across town grew louder. Everyone already suspected who they belonged to, but only forensics could confirm it. The mass was transported to a state forensic lab where technicians began the slow process of separating what the ocean had fused together. Barnacles had formed across clothing fibers, shells had attached to exposed bone, and fishing line wrapped tightly around parts of the skeletal frame. The work was painstaking, each movement catalogued and photographed, because every detail could matter. Within hours, examiners were able to make out the unmistakable structure of a human skeleton. The ribs were intact, the spine partially preserved, the skull fractured but still recognizable. Forensic anthropologists noted immediately that the condition was consistent with remains long submerged in salt water. It was the clothing that brought the first real jolt of recognition. Beneath the layers of sea growth were fragments of fabric, faded threads of a plaid shirt, and remnants of trousers. Investigators cross-referenced these findings with the original missing person report. Robert's daughter had told them her father left the house that morning in a plaid shirt, light brown trousers, and his old fishing boots. Though much had disintegrated in the water, what remained aligned exactly with her description. Technicians held up the fabric samples, their patterns faint but still visible, and the connection became undeniable. The next step was DNA confirmation. Bone fragments were carefully collected and prepared for testing. Because Robert's daughter had submitted her DNA years earlier in the hopes of identifying any remains, the lab already had a direct comparison. When the results came back, the match was clear. The skeletal frame tangled in the nets was Robert Hensley, the fisherman who had vanished from the pier 16 years earlier. The announcement sent ripples not only through his family, but through the entire community. A case that had sat in silence, treated like a story of the past, was now very much alive again. News outlets seized on the development. Headlines spoke of "The Fisherman Found After 16 Years" and "Cold Case Resurfaces from the Sea." Reporters revisited old interviews, playing clips of family members begging for answers back in the early days of the investigation. Footage of the pier reappeared on television, the same pier where his belongings had been found untouched, the same pier that now felt like the origin point of something much darker. Cameras gathered outside the police station as detectives confirmed that the remains were Robert's. The case had shifted overnight from a mystery to a forensic investigation. For the family, the news was both relief and devastation. After years of waiting, they finally had confirmation that Robert was gone. There was no longer a question of whether he had wandered away, started a new life, or been swallowed by the sea without a trace. His body had been there all along, preserved by the water, tangled in nets that had hidden him just beyond reach. His daughter described the feeling as an answer I never wanted, but always needed. Yet even with confirmation, the discovery brought with it new questions, ones that unsettled her more than the silence had. Forensic analysis revealed troubling details. The skeleton showed fractures on several ribs, injuries that could not easily be explained by water alone. More disturbing was the condition of the wrists, where grooves in the bone suggested the possibility of restraint. And then there was the fishing line, wrapped in a way that did not look accidental, entangled so tightly that examiners debated whether it had been intentional. Was Robert caught in his own equipment, pulled under by a tragic accident, or had someone forced him into the water, binding him before he drowned? The evidence left space for both possibilities, and neither brought peace to the family. Detectives reopened the file with renewed focus. They revisited the pier, re-interviewed witnesses, and looked again at the rumors that had circulated all those years ago. Old feuds, mysterious cars, the stranger some fishermen had noticed before the disappearance. Suddenly, every theory seemed relevant again. The difference now was that investigators had proof of death and potentially proof of foul play. The community watched closely, torn between relief that Robert had finally been found and dread over what his remains might reveal. For those who had been there 16 years earlier, the recovery felt like stepping back into the same nightmare. Fishermen who had sworn the water was calm that morning now wrestled with guilt. Had they missed something beneath the surface? Neighbors who had traded rumors wondered if they had overlooked a clue that could have prevented years of unanswered grief. The pier once again became a place of hushed voices, a reminder that the mystery had never been solved, only waiting. And so, after years of silence, Robert's case returned to the headlines with disturbing force. What the nets revealed was not just a skeleton, but evidence that suggested his disappearance might never have been an accident at all. As forensic teams pieced together the story from the fragments left behind, the question that haunted the town resurfaced, sharper than ever. Who, or what, had taken Robert Hensley from the pier that morning? The forensic examination of Robert Hensley's remains began with the hope of finally explaining what had happened that morning on the pier. For his family, the discovery alone had been both a heartbreak and a relief. They finally had proof of what they had long feared, but they needed more than confirmation of death. They needed to know how it had happened. At the state lab, examiners worked meticulously, documenting every fracture, every mark left on the bones after 16 years underwater. What they uncovered immediately unsettled the narrative that Robert had simply slipped, fallen, and drowned. The rib cage bore multiple breaks, several of which appeared consistent with blunt force trauma. They were not the type of injuries typically caused by drowning or by slow submersion. These fractures suggested impact, as if Robert had been struck or forced against a hard surface before ending up in the water. More troubling still were the signs of restraint. Along both wrists, grooves had formed where bone met pressure, the kind of wear consistent with binding. Examiners noted that these could not have been caused by random entanglement in fishing line alone. The evidence suggested something deliberate, an act of force before or during his disappearance. Detectives reviewed the findings with a mix of excitement and unease. For 16 years, the working theories had included accident, medical episode, or voluntary disappearance. But the forensic results shifted the investigation into darker territory. Robert had likely not gone into the water by choice or by accident. Someone may have put him there. This realization pushed the case back into active status, and investigators began to revisit every interview, every rumor, every overlooked detail from the original file. They returned to the family first. His daughter listened in silence as detectives explained the injuries. Her hands trembled when she heard the word binding. For years, she had fought against suggestions that her father had wandered off or chosen to leave. Now, the evidence supported what she had always believed. Someone else was responsible. But the revelation also brought anger. If investigators had treated the case differently at the beginning, would the truth have surfaced sooner? Could the years of uncertainty and family fracture have been avoided? As detectives re-examined the old notes, the rumors that once seemed flimsy suddenly carried new weight. The whispers of a dark sedan parked near the pier that morning. The memory of a stranger watching from the boardwalk in the days leading up to the disappearance. Even the suggestion of lingering family disputes now took on new gravity. Motive was the missing piece, and investigators were forced to consider possibilities that had once seemed implausible. Did Robert know something he shouldn't? Did a private grudge escalate into violence? Or had he simply been the victim of opportunity, an easy target, alone on a pier at dawn? The town, too, responded quickly to the forensic revelations. News spread that Robert's body had been found with broken ribs and possible restraints, and speculation returned with renewed energy. At the diner, conversations grew tense. Some insisted this was proof of foul play, that the town had harbored someone dangerous all along. Others doubted, suggesting the injuries could have occurred post-mortem, that the water in the nets might have caused damage mistaken for violence. But the possibility that Robert had been attacked was enough to unsettle everyone. It reopened fears that someone in their small community might have been responsible. For the family, the renewed investigation was both comforting and torturous. Old suspicions resurfaced. His brother was once again quietly scrutinized, despite his consistent cooperation. Neighbors who had once been absolved of suspicion found themselves whispered about again. Every unsolved mystery in the area seemed connected in conversations, though police reminded the public that speculation was not evidence. Still, the idea that Robert had been harmed lingered, too strong to dismiss. Detectives worked through the file, re-interviewing fishermen who had been on the pier that morning. Some had little new to add, but one recalled an unusual silence from Robert's usual spot, a moment where his chair looked empty earlier than expected. Another described feeling watched that morning, though he admitted he had no clear memory of who it might have been. Each account was frustratingly vague, clouded by the passage of time, but when paired with the forensic evidence, they created a narrative impossible to ignore. Robert had likely encountered someone on the pier. The investigation now hinged on connecting the injuries to a potential suspect, but without surveillance footage, witnesses, or fresh leads, the trail was thin. The case file, though thick with old interviews, contained no smoking gun. What it did have now, however, was evidence strong enough to suggest foul play. That shifted everything, not just for detectives, but for the family and the town that had lived under the shadow of the mystery for years. As detectives closed their notebooks after yet another round of interviews, they admitted privately that the truth might never be fully recovered. 16 years had eroded memories, washed away physical evidence, and left only bones and fragments to tell the story. But those bones carried a message clear enough to reignite the case. Robert Hensley had not simply slipped into the water and vanished. Something had happened to him that morning on the pier, something violent, something deliberate. The revelation left the community once again staring at the pier with unease. What had once seemed like an unsolved disappearance was now a potential crime scene frozen in time. The silence that hung over those boards carried new meaning. Robert had been taken from that place, and if foul play was involved, then someone had walked away knowing exactly what had happened. The pier, 16 years later, no longer symbolized mystery alone. It now represented the shadow of an unanswered crime. The recovery of Robert Hensley's remains had promised answers, but what it delivered instead was a deeper, heavier uncertainty. The forensic findings pointed away from accident, away from the comforting thought of a simple fall into calm water. Broken ribs, grooves in the wrists, and tangled lines suggested that something darker had happened that morning on the pier. Yet no suspect ever emerged, no confession, no witness willing to step forward after all those years. The investigation reignited briefly, detectives knocking on doors and revisiting old rumors, but each lead ended the same way it had years before: thin, inconsistent, and unprovable. For the family, the confirmation of Robert's death brought an end to one kind of waiting but opened another. His daughter was able to bury what remained of him, laying him to rest near his parents, a grave finally giving her somewhere to go when she needed to speak his name. But even at the graveside, she admitted that closure was incomplete. Knowing he was gone did not explain why or how or who might have been responsible. She described it as living with two truths at once, grateful to have him home, but tormented by the suspicion that someone had taken him from her long before he should have been. In the town, whispers returned in full force. The story of the fisherman who disappeared became less about mystery and more about suspicion. Some pointed back to his old family feud, others to the dark car seen near the marina, and still others suggested the stranger on the boardwalk may have played a role. But none of it hardened into fact. Each theory dissolved when pressed too closely. Even those who had been certain for years that Robert had simply fallen into the water now shifted their beliefs, unsure of what to think in light of the forensic evidence. The pier, once a place of routine and comfort, was transformed in collective memory into the scene of something unexplainable, perhaps criminal. Detectives admitted privately that the odds of solving the case after so long were nearly impossible. 16 years had washed away evidence, eroded memories, and left behind only fragments. Any witness who had seen something unusual would likely remember only pieces, unreliable at best. Any person who might have been responsible had either hidden well enough to survive suspicion or had long since blended back into the ordinary fabric of the town. The case sat once more on a shelf, reclassified as unresolved, the kind of file that carried weight but little hope. For the grandchildren, now adults, their lives had been marked by the shadow of the disappearance. They had grown up in a family defined by grief, by unanswered questions, by the silence of investigators who could never give them the truth. They attended the burial with a mix of sorrow and anger, struggling with the reality that the man they had lost as children had only been returned as fragments of bone. For them, the pier was not just a place their grandfather had loved. It was a scar across their family's story, a reminder of the morning that had reshaped their lives. As months passed after the discovery, the town once again settled into its rhythm. Boats left the harbor at dawn, fishermen baited lines, tourists walked the boardwalk, and children ran across the planks that still creaked underfoot. But for those who remembered, every glance at the far end of the pier carried weight. That was where Robert's chair had sat, where his jacket had hung, where his coffee had gone cold. The details that once seemed ordinary had become permanent symbols of what was never answered. The case, officially, remains unresolved. No one has ever been charged, no motive uncovered, no confession made. The physical evidence raised troubling questions, but stopped short of providing certainty. To this day, investigators describe it as one of the most haunting cases in the region, not because of what was found, but because of what was never proven. An elderly fisherman, a man of habits and routines, disappeared without a trace, only to be recovered years later in a condition that suggested violence but offered no clear culprit. For his family, for his community, and for the detectives who still glance at his file from time to time, Robert's story is one that lingers in silence. Closure arrived only in the narrowest sense. His body was found, but the truth of his final moments remains lost to the water, to time, and perhaps to someone who has never spoken. 16 years later, the pier still carries that silence. It stands as both a place of memory and a reminder that some secrets, no matter how disturbing, never truly settle.